Hi folks, so I want to take a few minutes and talk to you a little bit more about making claims, specifically in your thesis statements and in your topic sentences. And I also want to unpack these terms because I think sometimes these are very scary terms. So let's begin with an overview of the essay structure. Now, I want to say from the beginning of this lecture that these are general guidelines and that you may have professors in the future who do things slightly differently. You may have different expectations, and also that these guidelines, in some cases, not all, but in some cases, are made to be broken. Which can be frustrating for students. So I want you to think of this less as a hard and fast rule that you absolutely must follow 100% of the time, and more like just additional tools for your toolbox and pretty good safe guidelines to get you through the essay writing process. And after you start writing more and more essays over time, you can really start playing with form and start playing with these guidelines. Okay, so the overview of the traditional academic essay is this, the essay structure here, it usually starts with the introduction paragraph, has multiple body paragraphs, and then it has a conclusion paragraph, right? And so this is like your traditional academic essay. In your intro, you generally have background information, right, about the topic. In the case of your upcoming essay, Essay 2, I ask you to introduce the authors, introduce the title of their work. Perhaps you want to include some biographical information to help us understand the viewpoints of the authors as we're going to be talking about kind of their arguments. All of those would be really good strategies. So I would say it's important if you're writing on Ta-Nehisi Coates, for example, to know about his past and to know that he is a black male, right, living in America, because that is very relevant to the topic of his essay. The same thing with Amy Tan. It's important to know that she's a Chinese American woman who was born in America and the daughter of immigrant Chinese, the daughter of Chinese immigrants. Because that is relevant to what she's talking about, right? So it's just basically any information you think your audience needs to know to understand your point in this essay. And typically in your introduction paragraph, you will end with your thesis and your controlling idea, right? And so one thing I want to be very clear about is that your thesis statement should always be a response to the prompt. You can write a beautiful essay, well written, well argued, well reasoned, but if it doesn't respond to the prompt, then that's going to be problematic. So you always want to make sure you're responding to the prompt. Your body paragraphs is where you're going to be establishing and developing the points that you made in your thesis. And so one thing I think sometimes people feel all this pressure to get everything in the thesis, but think about your thesis as kind of like the like the little quick summary of what your paper is about. So you don't have to feel this pressure to put everything in your thesis. You just want to give the general overview, and then you really develop each of those points. So your thesis is a way to kind of tell your audience, like, hey, here's exactly what's coming up. Spoiler alert, I'm giving you all the info now, but then you go back and you kind of back it up and talk about it in depth, right? So I like to use the analogy, and if this analogy works for you, great, and if not, then just ignore it. But I like to use the analogy of, like movie trailers. So the job of like a movie trailer is to tease you to get to want to know what's in the movie, but not to spoil anything. So you do not want your thesis to be a teaser trailer, right? You want it to be like the little blurb on like IMDb that like spoils the entire movie for you. So you don't want surprises. It's not a teaser. It's like, listen, here's like the 5 main things that happen. And bam, like your life is just ruined because it spoiled everything, right? So that's the job of the thesis, is to be like the party killer and spoil everything. And that's just the academic convention, right? And then your conclusion, it provides closure and wraps up the essay, right? So one thing I really want you to think about is Think about essay building. So we often have like these images like this one where it's kind of like these are three separate parts, but I want you to think about this as like three puzzle pieces that all need to fit together, right? So your intro really needs to fit into your body paragraphs. Your body paragraphs need to fit together and then lead into your conclusion. And we're going to talk more about that when we talk about body paragraphs in a second. But let's talk a little bit about thesis statements. So these are, again, some guidelines. I would say these are good guidelines for my class in particular. Again, some professors might do things a little differently. Like you will have some very traditional professors who will say thesis statement is one sentence and one sentence only. I'm kind of the mind that, you know, especially if you're doing more complicated things, one sentence isn't always going to cut it for a thesis statement. But these are kind of, again, the traditional rules. So traditionally, in an academic essay, the thesis is usually the last sentence of the intro paragraph, right? So the introduction paragraph. A good rule of thumb for me and for my class and my expectations is I would say aim for about 1 to 3 sentences, right? Again, I'm asking you to do some complex things, especially in this essay. It's a little bit more complex in terms of like what you're investigating, and you're analyzing more than one text and you're using a cultural lens. So don't feel pressure to put that all in one sentence. I think that's challenging, right? Again, this is very important. Make sure you're responding to the prompt in the thesis, right? That is your purpose of the essay. So you don't want your thesis to be just summary of the text. So if your thesis is something like, you know, Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about X, Y, and Z, that's not going to be responsive to the prompt. And we're going to look at that here in just a second. One thing I really want you to focus on is avoid using announcing language. Things like I think or I plan on discussing in this essay. So I see a lot of this where I will see something like, in this essay, I plan on discussing marginalization. Instead of telling me what your plan is, you need to just come out and say it, right? You want a strong claim, and I want you to like bang on your desk while you're doing it. So Coates argues blank, right? And bam! So you want that strong claim. Don't tell me that you plan on making those claims later. Just make a broad claim, right? And you want to make sure your thesis sets up your whole essay. So let's look at some examples. So one kind of guideline for this essay in particular is that your thesis should mention all 3 of your essay topics, right? So essentially, I'm asking you to combine 3 topics in this prompt. I'm asking you to choose one cultural lens, whether it's marginalization or othering or hegemony, right? So one cultural lens. And 2 readings, right? So the first reading, whatever you choose, and the second reading, whatever you choose, right? So I'm essentially asking you to do complex things with 3 different topics. So your thesis statement needs to cover all 3 of those because those are all 3 elements of your essay, right? So let me give you an example. So one paper topic perhaps might be your cultural lens is marginalization, right? And then you're going to choose to write on Letter to My Son and tribalism. So if that's the case, then for this essay, your thesis statement needs to have the words marginalization, and it needs to somehow refer to Letter to My Son or tribalism, or you can refer to the author, like Coates and Alexi. That's fine too. But it needs to mention these 3 things, right? If your essay topic, say you chose the cultural lens of othering, and then you have Fish Cheeks and Craving the Other as your 2 primary texts, then your thesis statement would need to mention these 3 things, right? So before you even start writing your thesis statement, this is a good first step. Ask yourself, what is my lens? What are my 2 texts? Okay, I need these 3 things in my thesis. The next step then would be to respond to the questions from the prompt, right? So how do your texts illustrate or discuss your chosen concept, and what might the authors be arguing or discussing about your chosen concept, right? So again, I don't think you should try to complete this in one sentence. So I gave you an example here of the first part of a thesis. So again, my paper topic, marginalization, Letter to My Son, and tribalism. So I say Coates, and I'm just going to refer to him as Coates because in the previous part of my intro, I've already introduced his full name. I've introduced the title of his work. So this is, again, my last sentence of this paragraph. So I can just say Coates. Coates argues that the African American community are victims of marginalization by discussing the harm done to Black bodies and the inaccessibility of the American dream. Okay. So this is my first sentence. So again, I'm going to check for my key ideas. So I have marginalization, bam, and I have coat / letter to my son, bam, right? So I've got my first two ideas here, and now a couple other things I want to draw your attention to, right? So it's nice and specific. So I clearly lay out what's coming in my essay. So I'm going to have probably a couple of paragraphs that talks about the harm being done to the Black bodies, and maybe a couple of paragraphs about the inaccessibility of the American dream, right? And then, since I don't have Alexi or tribalism yet, I'm going to need to add another sentence. Like similarly, Alexi demonstrates, and then I can talk, go on from there, right? So he argues or suggests this about marginalization through these ways, right? So that's kind of what I want you to practice with your thesis statement. And your writing activity for this week is going to ask you to work on a thesis. Okay, so paragraph building review. So your topic sentence claims are going to be very similar to your thesis statement in the sense that you want to get the main idea, but instead of the main idea of the whole essay, the main idea of the body paragraph, right? So again, this is just a little paragraphing building review reminder. You want to start off with that claim, give evidence and quotes, and then discuss and analyze, right? And we've been practicing these two a lot this week. So we've been practicing a lot of choosing quotes and analyzing quotes. So again, we're going to focus more on claims. So here's some guidelines for the claims. Make sure it connects back to the thesis, right? So it needs to mention your cultural lens. You should probably start most paragraphs with some sort of connection back to the cultural lens. You don't have to use that word every single time, but you need to make it clear, like, this is my point. My point of this whole essay is marginalization. Make sure you're specific, right? So what is the specific aspect of your cultural lens you're talking about in this paragraph? And this is really key. Make sure you aren't just starting your paragraphs with summary, right? So I don't want to see a body paragraph that starts with summary. You can use a little bit of summary as needed to introduce your quotes, but do not start, this is not a summary essay, so you want to focus on claims about your cultural lens. So about othering, about marginalization, hegemony, etc. So let's look at a couple examples. So here's my first claim. Coates argues that the African American community faces marginalization because of the physical harm done to Black bodies, in particular police violence, right? Okay, so this is similar to my thesis, but I have a nice specific lens here of the police violence, right? So identify the author, use spicy verbs, and then have one narrow specific topic for this paragraph. So everything in this paragraph should be about Coates, marginalization, and police violence, right? Another thing to keep in mind is that you want your body paragraphs to transition and to relate to each other, right? So again, you focus on how each paragraph relates to the next idea. And again, you just want one key point per paragraph. So let me give you an example of my second body paragraph, right? So I'm still going to be talking about marginalization, and I'm still going to be talking about harm to the physical bodies. But in this one, I'm going to be talking about the history, right? So Coates further argues that this marginalization and physical harm can be linked back to our country's founding and the treatment of slaves, right? So again, they're kind of related, still talking about marginalization, still talking about harm to the Black body, but this time we're not talking about police violence, we're talking about the treatment of slavery, right? So again, think about, like, how do all of your paragraphs fit together and relate together? And again, the next steps would then be choose evidence and then analysis. This can also happen with dissimilar ideas as well, right? So everything doesn't have to fit together in a similar fashion. It can also fit together in a dissimilar fashion. So this might be another claim. Not only does Coates suggest members of the African American community are physically marginalized, he also suggests they are marginalized and denied access to privileges such as the American dream, right? And then that body paragraph will be focused on the American dream, right? And then you would also want to think about how you're going to transition between authors. Like Coates, Sherman Alexie is an author who has experienced marginalization because of his race, or possibly unlike Coates, and then like show the dissimilarities, right? So however you want to transition, whether it's showing similarities or dissimilarities, again, you just want to make sure those paragraphs somehow relate to each other, right? So show the connections, show the puzzle pieces, how they fit together. And yeah, it doesn't have to be a perfect fit, but you want to show the connection between the two. Okay, folks, so that's what I want you to focus on for your next essay is think about thesis statements and think about topic sentence claims, strong claims.